For more on possible intervention in Syria, I'm joined by Anthony Clark Arend, a professor at Georgetown University here in Washington, D.C. Welcome to the show. Professor, you have the UN Special Envoy to Syria, Lakhdar Brahimi, saying that a strike without UN Security Council approval is against international law. So if that is the case, then why are the U.S. and its allies considering a move without the UN?
Well, there really is a potential other basis for using force under international law. It is, however, very controversial. It's called humanitarian intervention. Now, if you look at the British paper that was released earlier today, the British government actually makes an argument that humanitarian intervention might be lawful in this case. Now, as we know, if the Security Council authorizes the use of force, it's perfectly legal under international law. The concept of humanitarian intervention states that if a state is experiencing a horrible humanitarian crisis, genocide, mass atrocities, that other states can potentially intervene unilaterally, provided that the purpose is to stop those atrocities. So the British government made the argument that this could be the case in Syria. Now, there are a couple of very important things to note. One, as I said, this is a very controversial legal argument. It is not widely accepted. The United States itself has never explicitly endorsed humanitarian intervention as a legitimate legal approach. Another problem is the way Syria is being discussed, it's being discussed in terms of punishing, retaliating, taking punitive action. Humanitarian intervention, if it were lawful, and again, it's not supported by everyone, but if it were lawful, could only be undertaken to prevent ongoing atrocities or to stop imminent atrocities. So this is a potential argument that could be made, and as I said, the British government did in fact make it, and so that's likely why some others are saying there would be something that could be done outside the UN Charter framework.
So if the West moves forward with military action, what are the possible legal ramifications against them post-move?
So in other words, if the United States and its allies were to do this, well, obviously other states would condemn it. In some respects, it would be much like the invasion of Iraq in 2003, when that was condemned as a violation of the United Nations Charter. The United States and whomever is engaging in these actions could then lose a great deal of legitimacy, and it could prevent them from taking further action to actually solve the Syria problem. That I think would be a real difficulty. Now, because the United States and Britain are permanent members of the Security Council, there's not actually going to be any kind of Security Council punishment that could take place against the United States. But the ill will and the fact that it would seem to be yet another indication of U.S. and Western unilateralism, I think would have extremely negative impacts on U.S. foreign policy and indeed on trying to do something constructive about the Syrian crisis.
And Professor, we're all waiting for this report from those UN inspectors inside Syria, depending on what they find this weekend. What happens if the UN cannot assign responsibility? For example, if they realize and say that chemical weapons are used, but can't pinpoint the party responsible, what happens then?
See, that's very important. If we look at the situation prior to the Iraq War, there were all these allegations about having weapons of mass destruction. It turns out Iraq did not have weapons of mass destruction. I think the international community is going to be extraordinarily reluctant to do anything if you cannot attribute the use of chemical weapons to some individual. Now, many suggest that the government has been responsible, but there's so many different groups. There's so many different rebel factions that it may very well be hard to pinpoint responsibility. And I certainly think that one should be reluctant to use force unless you can definitively attribute it to the government or some other entity before you would do anything.
All right, Professor Anthony Arend from Georgetown University, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your time.
Thank you. My pleasure.